Think of a big fish that eats lots and lots of bugs. I'll give you a sec to lock in your answer. Now, how many of you said trout? If you did, you're certainly not wrong. Trout are by far the fish most associated with eating bugs, particularly off the surface. But they're certainly not the only ones. Bluegills eat lots of bugs too. I mean, heck, so do carp and walleyes and even catfish under the right circumstances, like during a cicada or hexfly hatch. But what about smallmouth bass? And no, I'm not talking about little dinky creek smallies. I'm talking about high caliber small jaws, 5 and 6 pounders measuring 20 inches or better. Believe it or not, flying insects are a major food source of these heavy hitter fish during the summer, especially in moving water. In fact, you could be missing out on one of the coolest smallmouth bites you've ever experienced right now. But don't fret, because today we're going to learn all about how to capitalize on these bug-drunk trophy bronzebacks. I'm Outdoor Life Fishing Editor Joe Cermele, and this is the Quick Strike Podcast. If there are dragonflies and damselflies buzzing around or mating on smallmouth-filled water, rest assured the bass are eating them. Now, it's fair to point out, though, that their level of interest in these airborne snacks will vary by location. As an example, right, on my eastern home water, the Delaware River, the smallmouth bass gets so occupied with young-of-the-year shad in July and August that dragonflies, frankly, they're like a carrot stick compared to all those delicious French fries swimming around. Throughout the Midwest, though, it's a completely different story. My eyes were open to the magic of massive smallies sipping tiny bugs a few years ago when I visited Tim Landwehr on the Menominee River in northern Wisconsin. Now, Tim is the owner of Tight Lines Fly Fishing Company in De Pere, Wisconsin, and is one of the country's leading authorities on fly fishing for smallmouths. Now, prior to meeting up with Tim, I'd had plenty of success fishing topwater flies for bass on rivers like the Susquehanna and Juniata closer to home. But the way the fish on the Menominee ate was just different. Everything Tim showed me about what patterns to use, what kind of water to target, and how to present the flies changed my entire perspective on topwater smallmouth fishing. In fact, so burned in my brain was the vision of that first 5-pounder rising in clear water to just ever so gently sip a little popper that I went back just this summer for round 2. That meant I got to sit down with Tim in person in his legendary Northwoods Guide Camp, which isn't a bad place to spend a few days. The key points of the program that he lays out today should get you thinking about new ways to approach your home smallmouth water. And yes, even if you don't fly fish, I promise this will help you too. Hanging out all the way in the Northwoods, Pembine, Wisconsin, in the Guide Camp, which is an old ranger station, which I loved him.
Yes,
with the legend Tim Landwehr of Tight Lines Fly Fishing Company in De Pere, Wisconsin. We've been buddies since a video project way back in 2020. And I am all the way up here, all the way up in Wisconsin to fly fish for smallmouth with Tim, because the last time I did this, I was just so blown away by your fishery here and by your program. I've been fishing smallmouth my whole life, but never had I seen anything quite like this before. Like, you've got a very unique thing going up here.
We do.
Yeah.
We do. It's an incredible thing. We have a lot of topwater smallmouth.
Right.
They love topwater.
Right. So what you come up here for is these insane eats with very large fish. Now, you're fishing the Menominee River, right? And you have fish to 5-6 pounds easily in this river system.
They do.
That I was blown away when I first visited you, because it's almost hard to believe when somebody says, put this little basically foam dry fly out there in a few inches of water and watch what happens. And these huge fish come up and just daintily sip these bugs, right? And I had never before seen smallmouth fishing quite like that. And it sort of rewrote like what I knew about topwater fishing, fly fishing specifically, for smallmouth bass, right? So, I guess my first question to you would be, when you give somebody a popping fly, because you spend so much time throwing poppers, what does the average person think you do with a popper?
Oh, they're going to pop it, man.
Right, exactly.
I'm going to pop it. I'm going to make some noise with this.
Yeah. So, I mean, you see a scooped mouth. The instinct of so many anglers when you're doing that is to pop these bugs. And we think of smallmouth as being very aggressive, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'd like to point out that I'm recording this with Tim after 2 days of just some of the most insane smallmouth fishing.
It was a pretty epic couple of days.
We had an incredible couple of days fishing up here, and I got just what I came for, where it is just absolutely heart-stopping to see some of these fish rise to these bugs. And your operation, 25 years you've been guiding up here now?
It's been 24 years.
24 years,
yep.
right.
13,000 guide trips.
But you and your crew, sort of like pioneers of engineering and figuring out this bite up here, right?
I would say that's accurate. I mean, just kind of watching the process of how smallmouth eat, from streamers to all of a sudden how they eat poppers, and now how we eat some of the finesse stuff.
Right.
So we've watched the progression over this years.
So tell me just a little bit about like the early days of fishing here, because I mean, now you've got everything so wired and the program is so dialed. But you know, what was sort of the light bulb moment in your past when you're like, man, a 5-pound smallmouth in not very much water will rise up and eat a pretty small bug?
Right. Well, I mean, how that all started is like when we first began, it was just like Murdich minnows, big bait fish patterns.
Right, streamer patterns, subsurface, yeah.
And we talked about it today. Like we could go down the river and we get 40, 50 fish and just fish Murdich minnows and stuff.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden we started watching these fish follow some of these flies.
Right.
Like they were followers right to the boat and maybe not a bite.
Right.
And then we started fishing more topwater and popping bugs and seeing, you know, the interactions that you'd have with those. And then even some of that would fade away, and you would find some of these passively feeding fish that were not aggressive feeders.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, smallmouth are not like always just going to grab a giant fly or grab a giant bait, whatever you're fishing. And we would watch these fish come up, and it wasn't necessarily like how they blew up the fly. It was like how slowly they would come up and watch the bug.
Yeah.
And sit under the bug.
Right.
And they would make a conscious decision of like, I'm going to eat it now.
Right.
So it was like, we classified it in two things. Like you would have like the aggressive bite or like the blow up bite, and then you would have the confidence eat.
Yeah.
And the confidence eat was exactly that small fly eat.
Yeah.
And we were leaving so much on the table.
Yeah.
We were leaving so much on the table, just throwing big meat.
Yeah.
Fishing popping bugs and popping them super hard.
Sure.
So that's kind of what we watched happen.
Sure. Do you think it's fair to say that people don't realize how important aquatic insects and even terrestrials, to that matter, are to the diet of smallmouth bass? I mean, to your point, we were talking today, there's no shortage of crayfish in your rivers here, right?
Right. And I think that's a weird deal, because in any other world of fishing, you would fish to the biomass. Like what do you have here? What's the most abundant?
Yeah.
And we have a silly amount of crayfish. We have a silly amount of bait fish.
Yeah.
And now granted, we have every insect that lives in here too, but like that's a small piece of protein. However, so many of these fish prefer it.
Right.
I mean, like they will come up gingerly and eat that offering versus some of this big giant stuff.
Sure.
Which in our mind would tell us like, you throw that big stuff, that's where you're going to get the bites.
Sure. Yeah, and here's the thing, right? You have a whole fly fishing operation up here, but I mean, we were even talking about it a little bit today. It's not outside the question that occasionally you get clients who maybe can't fly fish or don't want to.
Happens often.
So a lot of what you're doing with flies can be replicated with topwater conventional lures, like a pop-R or something like that.
Absolutely.
Right.
You can fish some of the lighter stuff, some of the smaller pop-Rs, things like that.
Hula poppers and things like that.
Little torpedoes, stuff like that are still going to play out.
Sure.
And in fact, we've had some situations where people bought casting bubbles and even some of our other stuff and utilizing that same technique.
Sure. But what was so mind-blowing to me the first time I fished here was, I mean, look, fair to say, like, especially with big smallmouth, any river system, I don't care where it is. I live right on the Delaware. I fish for smallmouth all over. The average angler, especially in the summer months when it's hotter out, you are just glued to that idea that 5-pounder, I need to go to the deepest hole for that. I need to take a Ned rig or a Senko or a sinking fly or a Clouser minnow, and I'm fishing the holes. And again, I could not get my head around it when I fished with you the first time. You're telling me to put this floating fly over foot of water or less, 10 inches of water in some cases. Today, we had fish to 5 pounds that were, their noses were practically kissing the bank in inches of water, that when you put the fly down they would just hear it and make it looked like a fire hydrant underwater, waking over to eat these bugs.
But they still ate it slow.
Ate it slow.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
It's just this gentle sip. So I think it's because I know that what you do here and what you've learned can translate to so many people's smallmouth water across the country. I want to start what makes up the right kind of water for this presentation? So if you're going to do this at home on your creek or your stream, what have you figured out in terms of what makes up the ideal speed, depth, whatever it may be? And I know it varies for finding these smallmouth that are cued in on surface insects.
That's a super good question, because there is a very specific style water that you look for.
Yeah.
And we talked about it today. I call it a walking pace water, where the boat, if we're fishing out of a drift boat or a craft that floats, it's kind of the same smooth current speed that the boat is going at, and that the current is going at. The other thing that you want to look at is that bottom. I don't want gravel bottom. I want big rocks, little rocks, all of that stuff. And I want thigh deep water.
Uh-huh.
And that is where those fish hunt.
Right.
So those fish that are up there, those are 100% players, but they don't always want the big stuff. A lot of times, even a popper fished aggressively or a minnow, they don't bite that.
Right.
But they will patrol the snack bar.
Right.
It's that fly is just floating over there, and I'll have those smallmouth come up and sit underneath that thing, fins flared, looking at it.
Yeah.
You've seen it, Joe,
it's
a couple
intense.
of times.
It's intense. Yeah.
And they come up and you're waiting for the big bass bite, because the bass bite is in quotations, it's going to be this explosive thing. It's
right.
The big ones, we're going to eat it small.
Right.
So water characteristics are that. The other thing we get questions on all the time is does this work on my stream? I have that style of water. But if you have dark, muddy water, that finesse style fishing does not play into that.
Sure.
Our water is red from tannins, but it's clear.
It's dark, but it's clear.
It's clear.
Yeah.
So they feel that fly and they hear that fly. And you saw it the last couple of days. When that fly hit the water, those fish knew it.
We had one eat we can talk about, because it was truly, you said it was the coolest eat you had all season.
Yeah, I've been on the river all year. It was
one of the coolest smallmouth eats I've ever seen. We're fishing with a buddy of mine, Miles Nolte, was on the boat with us today. And this fish actually gave itself away. It made a dimple up on the surface, and we went, oh, there's one. And he cast it and he goes, oh, I was behind it. And you were like, no, he heard it. And he did. And he swung right around and just inhaled this fly. And I remember you teaching me the first time we met, and this is an important lesson here for poppers, because again, people want to pop a popper.
Right.
I see that in saltwater. I see it in freshwater. I see it with snakehead fishing.
Sure.
If it's got a popping mouth, people want to chug it. I've even seen it mouse fishing for trout. People want to chug these topwaters, and that's not the move. And you had said something to me the landing. That's pop number one.
That's number one.
So tell me about the subtlety of how you fish a popper specifically.
Well, the subtlety is that, and that's a super important point, because when somebody hits that fly on the water, that fish is already tuned into that fish knows it's there. We've saw it multiple times throughout the last couple of days.
Yeah.
That fish felt that.
Right.
So if you pop it, it hits the water, and then you pop it again, a lot of times the fish is underneath that bug, and the second pop freaks him out.
Right. And this is a good point. But popping in clear water can scare fish. It
Absolutely.
can do the opposite of what you're trying to do. Right?
Absolutely. It's a predatory fish.
Yeah.
But some of these fish are, they get spooked off by some of that stuff. That's not what they're eating.
Right.
Because if that were the case, you could throw gigantic streamers all the time and come up with the exact same result every day.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it doesn't work that way.
Sure.
The other thing is when a fly hits the water, or conventional tackle, whatever you're fishing with, if you're in skinny water, like knee deep water, small pop, small water.
Right. Okay.
Bigger pop, deeper water.
Okay.
If you're running a ledge or something like that, where you have to drive that fish up from some distance,
sure,
you can make a little bit noise on that,
right.
But man, a lot lot of times, and I was telling you guys the last couple of days, just bend its legs. That's the pop.
Yeah, because every once in a while, again, I can't reiterate how crazy it is to see a fish of some of the calibers we've seen come up so slowly and look, or they'll maybe sometimes they'll give you a little boil to sort of give themselves away. And that's exactly what you said. Don't pop it. Just let them know it's alive. And again, and I think this confuses people with popping flies in particular. They're always tied with rubber legs, and I think a lot of people think that's just like a cute accoutrement, right? There's a reason why.
To be honest, the balsa or the cork is the delivery system for the rubber legs.
It's
the rubber legs. That's the delivery system.
The rubber legs there's a reason why patterns like that have these extra long rubber legs, because it takes very little movement just to make them twitch. And for smallmouth, sometimes that's all you need. At the same time, I mean, in skinnier water in particular, how many times do you just lay down, bang? I mean, like the second you lay down, if he's looking for it. So it was really an eye-opening thing to see how you fish poppers up here. But there's certainly a lot more options than that. Now, you do this even in a more subtle way with, what is it? Is it Mr. Wiggly?
Yeah, Charlie's old Mr. Wiggly.
Charlie's old Mr. Wiggly. Tell me a little bit about that fly.
Well, I mean, what we ended up seeing in a couple situations, which is really kind of a weird thing to figure out in the smallmouth world, is I've seen some of those skinny water flats where I've stood up on my rower seat, and let's say, I remember the day it was with Bob Harrison, a group that's fished with me for 20 years.
Yeah.
And we threw a popper up on this flat where I physically saw like 7 or 8 smallmouths just swimming gently on this flat. He threw that popping bug up there, and I watched the fish. They didn't scatter, but they like bristled up and they moved away.
Yeah.
Like just its presence was enough to move those fish off of it. And then there's a gentleman. It's a long story that'll cut real short. Jack Allen, who was a good friend of Dave Whitlock's, came up with these spider patterns. He called them the Nouveau spider. So it looked like a bastardized bluegill fly. And we started fishing some of these finesse style.
Yeah.
And those fish, I remember with Bob that day, the fish, I popped it, they blew off. I picked up the anchor. We put on one of these finesse flies, and every one of those other fish did not leave the flat. They were nervous, but they came up and they sipped it.
Got it.
They did not eat the popper, but they ate the wiggly.
Right.
That style of fly.
Right.
And that's like next level of finesse smallmouth fishing.
Sure. And people, I don't think, again, associate that level of subtlety. Now, little dinky bass on creeks, they take a shot at anything. Like you can throw practically trout flies, completely different fish. But that's what was so insane, was seeing how these high caliber, I mean, the biggest players in your river and other rivers, just are so quick to react to something so subtle.
That's it.
And, what you had said about, less popping in shallow, you can make a little more noise deep. I mean, that's something that I've seen apply to just conventional fishing with something like a popper. I mean, same deal. I mean, subtlety wins in topwater smallmouth, I think, more often than not. And you just have to be aware of that you're not always trying to make the most noise. Now, this game sets up really well that you play with a fly rod from a drift boat. Yep. And explain why. And it's the way you cover water in angles.
Yeah, and the drift boat is such a cool tool. It's a drift boat, it's a John boat, it's whatever you're floating a watershed with. But it's really important that those flies are presented at like a 45-degree downstream angle. Mm-hmm. Show the fly before you show the boat and show yourself. Yeah. It also sets up the angle of like the hook set and a million other things on it.
Right.
But like what we're trying to do is like that fly hits the water, you are covering a huge amount of water.
Right.
So even if one fish doesn't hear it on the drop, it might feel it on the wiggle. Yeah. And then we can play that and look for those players for a long distance. Yeah. So that's kind of how it works. But that angle is so key. And that's was so nice the last couple of days having you guys here. You understood that steep angle down there. Show them the fly.
We'll be right back after this short break. What advice would you have? Because look, not everybody has a floatable river. Yep. Not everybody has the means to do that.
Yep.
So if you're playing this game with a fly rod from shore, how do you advise somebody? Because I imagine in your fly shop, you get people coming in all the time that want to do this. They don't have a drift boat. They don't have a raft. How do things change?
I mean, the hard part on foot is just your inability to cover a great distance. Sure. You and I talk about on some of your local streams. But it's just a little bit harder. You just maybe have to cast. You can't have that steep angle when you're on foot because you're going to get zero drift off of it. Right. So whether you're fishing with conventional or anything else, maybe it has to be directly across the bank, an upstream mend with a fly, or whatever you have to do with that conventional piece of tackle. But just cover those pieces of water methodically where those fish live.
Yeah. So I'm curious, I mean, up here in the upper Midwest, what time of year does this game kick on for you? When can you reliably know that you'll get them to rise to insects?
That's a tough one because like I can get them to rise to poppers. I've gotten them to eat poppers in 40-degree water, 38-degree water.
Really, that cold?
May. Every May, our guides
and it makes no difference if there's no dragonflies buzzing around or any of that.
Zero.
Yeah.
Zero. Some of them will still eat. You look for specific water, back bays, stuff that's been heated up by the sun for a period of time.
Sure.
It's like this is where like pre-spawners are going to start to look for stuff.
Yeah.
But it's always a race for our guys the first part of May.
Yeah.
Like who guides will text me like 11:40 on May 3rd, first popper fish.
Really?
And stuff like that.
Yeah.
But reliably, first part of June for us, because we see the big migration of dragonflies and things like that, where it's like this is a viable insect source that's in abundance.
Right.
But I would say like June through August is solid. And most people are waiting too long for the game to begin.
Really?
I think so.
So you think people associate this style of fishing or this style of presentation more to like a late summer thing when really it's happening sooner than they realize?
I think so. I think, not to confuse things, but the difference between the popper game and the wiggly game is different. Like the popper game still has some audible profile of like they can hear that a little louder than a wiggly or something. So the popper game's going to start a little bit earlier than that. But those wigglies after the dragons start hatching like June 1st, June 5th, like that wiggly game is now on the table.
Yeah.
As we trickle into the summer and the water levels drop, the water levels dropping is really the key to the finesse game.
Got it.
So that's it. If you're fishing high water, man, you can fish top water in the weeds and stuff, and like the fish are right up inside of there. But as the water drops out, that's when it separates, where it's like now we have to get real about our fishing.
Well, you talked about fishing the weeds. I think that's important. Vegetation for your system plays a large role in this, right?
It does.
Yeah.
Because we will see the vegetation. We've had high water this year, so like the grass is going to grow to what the water level is.
Sure.
And then obviously the water level is going to drop down.
Yeah.
But when you get some of that eel grass and some of that wavy grass that's now on the surface, it's a collection of damselflies. Damselflies for us in the upper Midwest here are after 4th of July, just before the 4th of July, we see huge migrations of those.
Right.
Or not migrations, but hatches of these. And those fish, people think you have to see the bass rise to it before you start fishing.
Sure, yeah.
It's not the case.
Yeah, I mean, even fishing the last few days with you, a few fish gave themselves away. It's like, oh, there's one that ate. And I've seen it like during whitefly hatches and things where there are times when the water boils with smallmouth and it looks like rising trout.
Yep.
But I'm glad you brought that up because you don't need to see feeding activity. Furthermore, it's crazy because the idea of early and evening in fly fishing topwater is so beaten into our heads.
It is.
You go early or you're doing the trout hatch and it's going to be just before dark.
Yeah.
Man, high noon, bright sun, 90 degrees.
We got all of our big fish the last couple of days.
Water lit up. In fact, you almost seem to, like, you want the visibility. You want the water lit up for this.
Yeah, I want to be able to see those shelves. I want to be able to physically see that water column. Like, what am I physically fishing? That's what I want to see.
Sure.
And that's kind of the magic behind that. That's kind of how that works.
Yeah. And how late does it go? I mean, what is it? Is it pure temperature or is it the tapering off of dragonflies? Because like you say, with something more audible, like a popper, you can get fish to go on those much earlier in the season, even though there's no bugs yet. And the water, I mean, you said 38, 40 degrees, which is nuts. What is the sign? When do you know? Like
when it's tapering off, when it's done?
Yeah.
Well, what ends up happening, it's not the bugs, it's not anything else. It's like water temperature and our smallmouth become more migratory at that point, like wintering stuff.
Yeah.
It's all of a sudden like September, mid-September, cold fronts and stuff. And like, they're going to start to pot up deeper water and stuff.
Yeah.
And that's when it like, you get some of those warm days where like you're going to bang them on top water, but that's when like a float and fly or like whatever you're going to do is going to happen. So I would say for us in the upper Midwest, it's going to be like mid to late September where it's like, okay, now we got to change everything.
Yeah. I'm just curious, man, because you're well traveled and you're certainly well connected. So I mean, there's a lot of water in Wisconsin that sets up perfectly for this style of fishing. What are some of the other hot spots throughout the country that you know of? Like, where else is this style of fishing a big deal?
Well, what we've seen, like, it's been interesting because like our online store and some of that stuff, like we're seeing so many sales for some of these wigglies and stuff like Pennsylvania.
Yeah,
that's
like my turf. And
Michigan,
I've used these tactics that I picked up from you on the Susquehanna and Juniata very, very
so
successfully.
Obviously these guys are keying into the exact same kind of thing. And it's working because a lot of their watersheds are fairly similar.
Sure.
And it's becoming a real thing. Like the wiggly bite is now like, it's kind of a nationwide, like people know of it. We giggled about it when we termed it the wiggly bite because it just looked like a wiggly fly. But like, it's all over the place, but we see a lot over on the east side. Yeah.
And I think too, like we talked a little bit about conventional stuff and how you can kind of replicate some of these tactics. But again, you have to get out of your head that like you might be throwing a popper that is supposed to mimic a bait fish.
Yeah.
But you have to pretend, you have to get in the mindset of insects. Like a rebel pompar with a tail hanging down. When it's sitting there doing nothing, if you're being subtle about that looks more like a bug than a bait fish.
Absolutely.
So it does take sort of retraining your brain.
It does.
But it's like once you see it, because it happened to me, like once you see it, you're like, I can't believe that. And then it just changes everything.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
So you do have to get that out of your mind. And you also have to get out of your mind, like the predatory nature of a smallmouth is super cool because how tough they are. But like there are more layers to this game.
Yeah.
There are far more layers to the game.
Right.
And anything that you have in your toolbox extra.
Yeah.
That finesse fishing, that micro fishing, whether it's on a fly or it's on conventional tackle, it's like use that tool. It works. Trust in it. Have trust.
But it also has to be the right tool because I know you had mentioned that like you'll have clients come with their favorite 5-weight fly rod.
Yeah, that's the wrong tool.
That's the wrong tool. That's the incorrect tool.
That's the incorrect tool for some of these river fish.
Just give me the quick rundown of like what you're running on your boats for doing this.
No, we have exceptionally large fish. You know, all of the upper Midwest has crazy big smallmouth. But some of these guys will come up with 5- and 6-weight fly rods for your listeners that understand like fly rod weights.
Yeah.
That's trout tackle.
It's trout tackle.
It's trout tackle.
Sure.
And you start to rumble with one of these fish in heavy currents when an anchor is dropped.
Yeah.
You need 7- and 8-weight stuff, which is what we catch bonefish and redfish and all these. They can't even believe it. But when they cork one of those rods and like, I can't land it.
Right.
You need that rod.
Yeah. Now Tim does something very cool. If one of your clients catches a true 20-incher, right, they get the hat, the official 20-inch
they get
club
the hat,
right?
Yeah.
So just like what's a good year? In a good year, how many hats are you giving away up on the Menominee system, man?
Okay, all right. So I have to clarify this. So like, if you already received a hat,
can't get another hat.
So, but if you're asking
hats cost money, man.
They're not free. It's not a handout. And as you know, we are sticklers on what is a 20-incher. Like
we had one today that was like, we wanted
16th.
It was like a 16th off, but you can't.
It's a spectacular fish, and it happened to be the gentleman's like best fish by like a large margin,
sure,
which is a celebration in itself. Yeah. But it is one of those things like if you're asking me how many hats do I give away or how many 20-inchers are caught out of our camp in a year,
it's kind of the same thing. Yeah.
Well, last year was an exceptional year, and we do a lot of trips. But last year was like our best year ever. But like it was 123 20-inch fish.
123
over
now
20
think about
on
that,
a fly.
Right? For everybody who thinks that to catch bass of that caliber, you have to be deep, you have to be aggressive, you have to really play into their predatory urges. That many fish, 20 inches or better on tiny bugs rising with just the daintiest little sip.
Mm-hmm.
It is just a wild thing, man. And I'm so glad that I've gotten to do it. And we've had such an exceptional few days.
I'm so glad to have you, man. It was a spectacular couple of days, my brother. It was awesome.
So after fishing with Tim the first time, I raced back east to try his methods on my home waters, and I was pretty impressed with the results. Again, we don't have the same level of bug life he has, but what I realized was that prior to seeing it Tim's way, I was fishing too aggressively and often not casting to the waters where a genuine bug-hunting smallmouth might be lurking. So even though your and my home waters might not fish quite as epically as the Menominee, just because there's so much bug life, and the same goes for many other Midwest rivers, putting some of Tim's program into practice will catch you more fish no matter where you're fishing. Okay, and a reminder, summer is slipping away, so I highly recommend getting out there and giving it a try before fall gets here. I also highly recommend fishing with Tim if you get the chance. You won't regret it, and I can tell you his entire crew and operation are top shelf. You can find him on Instagram at Tightlines Fly Fishing Co. WI or tightlinesflyshop.com. And if you want to hear the full replay of my second visit this summer, check out episode 92 of my weekly long-form podcast, Cut and Retie, wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks, as always, to Mike Pederson of 85 Audio for making us sound so nice, so clean, and so sharp. And remember, if you have ideas for future Quick Strike topics, shoot me an email at quickstrikepodcast@gmail.com, or you can always find me on Instagram at Joe Cermele 138.